Welcome to the Jaded Buddha Podcast. This is a podcast where I discuss predominantly Hindu philosophy, but it dives some into Buddhist philosophy as well, and just sort of existentialism in general. In this episode, it's going to be sort of a stream of consciousness because I feel like it's often useful to have a prompt, but when you just start talking with no expectations and no expectation of where you'll go, it flows perfectly. And this is something that is impossible for many to grasp, that you can exist and make conversation without thinking. Because, at least for me, when I had incredibly bad social anxiety for many, many years, really since the beginning of puberty, and what it was like then was I always thought before I spoke. I thought about what's the best thing I could say next that would be the funniest and give them the most to work with. I was very afraid of having bland or awkward conversation. And the reason why these conversations didn't flow was because when you are so busy existing in your head and existing in your thoughts, for one, you're not really listening to them because you're hearing them, but you're not listening. And you're not paying attention. But also, when you think before you speak all the time, there isn't the natural flow that comes with incredibly deep and meaningful connections, where the deep, meaningful connections, where you're having a conversation with them and you're not thinking about what you say. You're not self-conscious, and it just flows perfectly. It's like your two minds are coming together into one. It's a very beautiful experience. And if you, in those situations, what you realize is that you don't need to think to be coherent. You don't need to think about what you say before you say it. Sometimes you can, it's good to, but a way to understand it is, you'll see you have a blank canvas that you're painting on, and you paint a whole bunch of stuff, a landscape in the background, and you can't create anything new, you can't make the art into something else, because there's already something there. In the same way, when we're having a conversation with someone, we're not able to think new thoughts and go with the flow of the conversation, because when you're overthinking, it's like the canvas is full. You can't paint something new on there. And in the same way, when your head is full of thoughts, you can't flow with conversation. This is something that seems very counterintuitive, because it's like when you're having a conversation with someone, you think, well, if my thoughts are coming out so in such an articulate way and they're able to understand me, I must be thinking. It must be coming from my thoughts. And so you believe that you have to think all the time before you speak, because you're sort of under the illusion that that thinking in the midst of conversation is translating into what you're saying. But if you're able to experience this sort of very deep connection with someone, where it flows perfectly and you don't need to think about what you say before you say it, you realize that you never had to in the first place. And really, conversation flows the best when you're not thinking about what you say before you say it. And I think the reason why I brought up this topic was because I said that this was going to be a stream of consciousness podcast. And so I'm just going to kind of jump around from one thing that I find interesting to next in spirituality, particularly Hinduism. A topic that I did want to discuss today is a very crucial part of Hindu, you could say Hindu culture. Hinduism is often seen as a religion, but it the Hinduism goes back over 2,000 years before Christ. So it has been growing and developing all across India for thousands of years. And because there's so many elements to Hinduism besides just the doctrine, would better be explained as a culture. In Hinduism, the topic of karma and reincarnation is incredibly is generally what people think of when they think of Hinduism. And I know at least what I thought when I used to ponder what happens after we die is I was thinking, I hope that there's reincarnation because I don't want to cease to exist. I hope that there's reincarnation, but I don't have any reason to believe it. And this is exactly the perspective that you take if you, for one, viewed Hinduism in the same way that you view other religions. And two, if you didn't actually get into it and try and understand the doctrine of reincarnation. This philosophy, you could say, has been around since before the beginning of Christianity. The doctrine of karma and reincarnation was what drove life in India. The Brahmin class, which was the highest class, they were generally the ones who were allowed to study the sacred texts. And the idea was that they were constantly chanting mantras and doing rituals because of the impact they believed it had on their karma. Because with the doctrine of reincarnation and karma, it can be understood as a deterministic system. It's the claim behind karma is that there is a universal law in which it could be understood as cause and effect, but a better way to view it is, at least in my opinion, it is like proof or a explanation of how the universe is deterministic, meaning that our lives are sort of predestined. And so this deterministic model of the universe is very frightening to some people, and it's very freeing to others, because for some, they feel that they're in control of all of their actions, and that life's just kind of senseless, and all these things are constantly happening and they don't mean anything. Like, it's sort of like a me versus life perspective, where you are being faced by all of these challenges that life throws at you, and it's you versus the universe, you as an individual versus the universe. But in the model of karma, everything that happens is in a way meant to happen. And for some people, they feel like this makes life lose all its meaning. If I'm not in control of my destiny, then, like, what purpose is there in living? If everything is predestined and I don't have any control, then what's the point? And you can spiral down there. But karma is an extremely essential component of Hinduism and Hindu philosophy that I must elaborate on so it makes sense. Because although I'm not critiquing Christianity necessarily, Christianity speaks of the soul quite a lot in the context of the relationship of the soul to God. But there is never a clear explanation as to what the soul was. because it seems like it should be obvious, we just kind of assume we know what the soul is. But if you think about it, it's a very odd idea. What is the soul? It's not defined in Christianity. And the metaphysics of the soul is not laid out. But this is one way in which Hinduism differs from Christianity, is the way that the soul can be explained. In my first lecture video on Advaita Vedanta, I talked about the soul to a certain extent with the analogy of the sun being the Atman, being the one consciousness, and our minds, or our individual souls, being like a mirror which is reflecting the light of the one, of God. You could also call God source, because it's this is only a metaphor, of course, but God is like the source of all consciousness. And because it is, every individual consciousness is this exact same consciousness, the Atman. And to elaborate on this, one way I can explain it is that the soul is like the omnipresent, loving awareness. I think God is often anthropomorphized in the sense that we shape our understanding of God around kind of a human-like model. We understand God almost as if he were a cosmic dictator, or like the ruler of all. But from the perspective of Hinduism, particularly from the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, the philosophy of non-duality, God isn't understood in that way at all. The way to understand God is in the context of Taoism. So we have the physical universe. You could call it the manifest universe. And I'll explain to you why it's referred to as the manifest universe. The manifest universe is filled with form. I'm looking at this microphone here, and it is a organization. It is a pattern of form. And you zoom in on a material and go down and down and down and down, and you just keep seeing different forms. So you have the manifest universe of form as the yin, as one side of the coin. And then you have the unmanifest as the other side of the coin. And the unmanifest is God. And in one word for it is Brahman, spelled Brahman. And what Brahman is it's described as inconceivable, indescribable, and unimaginable, because it's formless. Going back to my earlier explanation, the physical universe is made of forms. Like my body is my physical form. This cup is a cup form. There's the atomic form and the molecular form. And Brahman is formless, meaning it is just, you could call it emptiness, but emptiness isn't quite right, because emptiness implies unconsciousness. But what Brahman is, which is the Hindu term for God, Brahman is consciousness. And this is the consciousness that that I was talking about in the last two videos. This consciousness is exactly what one experiences when they're deep in meditation and their thoughts slow down until they're non-existent. And although you are not aware of your body, you're not aware of space, you're not aware of thoughts, you are aware. There's still a you who's there in the meditation. And you can't even really say you're in the meditation, because the you that exists in this point isn't doing anything. This consciousness, which is referred to as the Atman, I'll explain the difference between Atman and Brahman later, but this space through which our thoughts move, and the space within which our thoughts exist, and our emotions, and our physical sensations, within this consciousness, is a whole lot of stuff that's happening of itself. Your thoughts are happening of themselves. Your actions are happening of themselves. Your emotions are happening of themselves. And I'm simply explaining the Advaita Vedanta point of view. All of these things that we experience through our senses and in our mind is being witnessed by the consciousness. They are like clouds passing through the sky of consciousness. And just because we identify, the game of spirituality is to identify with the consciousness, it doesn't mean that you don't identify with your thoughts and with your body. Because the truth is, we are our thoughts, and we are our body, and we are everything that we do, and we are the impact that we have on other people's lives. But if we solely identify with our ego, with our thoughts, and with our body, and we aren't identified with the pure consciousness, with the God inside of us, then we are living in suffering. So, a way to understand reincarnation is that a piece of the light of Atman, a little sliver of this sea of consciousness, you could call it the universal consciousness, a little sliver of that is wrapped in a shell or a web of karma. Not literally, this is a metaphor, but a very good one at that. This little piece of the light was separated from its source, which is God, and it was trapped in a web of desires, of past experiences, of good and bad karma, meaning suffering you imposed on others is suffering that you will get back. I personally don't have a very clear understanding of that element of karma, which is what you carry with you from one incarnation to the next. It's not confusing necessarily. You have good and bad karma, which determine which your later incarnations. But for me, in my eyes, the reason why this doesn't make too much sense is because I feel personally that the division between good and bad is something that we're creating in our minds. Outside of our minds, one thing that we consider good and one thing that we consider bad are just what they are and nothing more. They're not in reality good nor bad. So I don't understand how, from a cosmic point of view, there's this sort of universal judgment of good and bad. I personally don't know. I can't say if it's true or not, but it is an important element to recognize, because a lot of spiritual seekers on the path, a lot of Buddhists and Hindus, they act very righteously. They live righteously. They help people a lot. They relieve their suffering. They often have a lot of charity. They give away the things that they have. And they are living in the service of others, but for the purpose of gathering good karma to be born into a pleasant incarnation in the next round. And one other area of the doctrine of reincarnation that's unclear to me, and it's unclear because there are many different explanations for how this works. You have three main types of karma. You have sanchita karma, and sanchita karma is the karma that it's like a warehouse of karma that is attached to your soul. It is the layers and layers of webs that have accumulated. And you also have agami karma, which is karma that is that attaches to the soul in this incarnation. It is karma that you're taking on in this life. And the last type of karma is... Sorry, it's slipping away from me. Oh, prarabdha karma. And what prarabdha karma is just imagine that the soul's nature is love. Its nature is light. Its nature is peace. Because those are all attributes of consciousness. Once you gain a direct experience and understanding of consciousness, which, to be fair, you're already having right now because you're conscious. But once you gain awareness of consciousness, you realize that it has those qualities of love, of warmth, of peace, of wholeness. Wholeness is a very big one. And once the soul gets covered in this net or web of karma, it's taking further incarnations to work out the karma, meaning that it's trying to shed the karma that's wrapped around it, separating it from the source or God. And if you imagine sanchita karma to be like a warehouse of accumulated karma from all of your past incarnations, then imagine prarabdha karma to be like a crane comes in and picks a certain amount of it out, and that is what becomes your life. That karma, the prarabdha, is your destiny. And so it is karma that's working itself out in this incarnation. So an example is our minds, mental habits that we have, desires that we have, certain elements of the way our life unfolds. It's all dictated by the prarabdha karma, which is sort of a little bit that's taken out of the warehouse of accumulated karma. And this is the way in which karma is a deterministic system, is that it's lawful determinism. Karma can be understood best as a universal law, because it is seen in Hinduism as the force that keeps God, which is one, pretending to be individuals, basically. If it was just God and there was no illusion of separateness, if there was no individual souls, then life would not be interesting at all. It is... What is so wonderful about our human existence is that it's very fun. It's very fun being an individual and having our own individual identities and identifying with them. Even getting lost in this game, if you use the analogy of a game, even if you get lost inside of this play, or it's better to understand it as a play, that's the whole point. The point is you have been God this whole time, and you are getting lost, pretending that you're not, so that you can experience yourself as an individual. It is God experiencing itself as an individual. And that God which I'm referring to is Atman, the one consciousness. And when people often talk about, in the moments of death, in near-death experiences, people say they experience themselves going into the light. And this is a place in which the metaphor of the Atman being like the sun fits in very well, is that the Atman is like a near infinite wellspring of energy and of love. It can be almost understood as the power grid behind the universe and behind everything. And this energy is an identity with consciousness, which is one, a confusing concept, and another one that's hard to understand based on our current definitions of consciousness. Because when I refer to consciousness, you might think that you know what I'm talking about. But what you have is your own model of what the word means. It's only a word, and we'll attach with it whatever definitions we understand. But when people talk about going into the light, well, the way that they often describe it is it's like this warm, loving light. And it's not like a room of light necessarily. The way that they explain it is that it's like infinite energy and love and light and peace. And this infinite, omnipresent energy is God, at least from my personal understanding of God. So, a way that you can understand kind of the game that we have going here is that all consciousness comes from the same source. There is, you could say, a piece of the light within each one of us. There is a piece of God inside each one of us, and that is our consciousness. And although it may appear that we have many different consciousnesses, there's my consciousness, there's your consciousness. We believe that for every being that exists, there is a different consciousness. But if you understand that every single being and every single consciousness all comes from the same source, which is God. Every consciousness is God. And this is why we talk about the manifest universe, is because what the universe is seen as in this model of reality is it's seen as God made manifest. If you've ever heard the term God made manifest in form, what that's referring to is, of course, there may be different interpretations of this, but what it can refer to is God being this infinite energy and consciousness, which I'm going to go into in a little bit, sort of reconciling it with our current understanding of science. But for now, I just want to talk about what this means and how we can integrate this understanding into our everyday experience. Because one problem that I had a great deal of when I was pursuing spirituality very intensely in a fanatic kind of way was I understood that everything in the universe, particularly every consciousness, is God made manifest in form. Going back to the model of yin and yang, it's like the manifest universe is yin, and the formless universe, the unmanifest universe is yang. And they are inseparable from one another. So, I had a lot of trouble looking at the world around me and looking at other people and experiencing what I knew, or what I understood from this philosophy. because it's a little bit strange and difficult to understand what it means that God is made manifest as the universe. Because in the Christian and from the Jewish and Islamic point of view, God is seen as something separate from the physical universe, like as more of a figure that had influence over the universe, rather than how it's seen in Hinduism, which is God is the universe itself. It is Brahman, or this pure consciousness, this formless beingness. It could be described as beingness. It is, in Hinduism, particularly in the Upanishads, the text, the Upanishads, it is exactly the same as existence. So, from the perspective of Hinduism, our consciousness, the consciousness that creates the illusion of individuality, this is exactly the same thing as existence. So, how Brahman is often described, particularly in the writings of Shankara, Sri Shankara, the great sage, the starter of the Swami order, actually, in India. When you see those people in yellow robes, the monks, they are often members of the Swami order. Not always, but the Swami order was started by this sage named Shankara. And the way Shankara described Brahman was the whole universe is superimposed on Brahman. Meaning, like, in the same way that you understand thoughts to be like clouds floating through the sky of consciousness, you understand that the entire universe exists within Brahman, within this consciousness. Because this consciousness is existence itself. So this is the way in which Hinduism is deeply philosophical, is that not only is there only one consciousness, the Atman, this one consciousness which is made manifest in 7.5 billion forms plus all the animals that exist. It made manifest as every being is exactly the same thing as existence. And so now it's starting to make some sense as to what God means in Hinduism. And although God is something that cannot be conceptualized or understood through contemplation, it can be understood in a certain way if you see that life is like a big play or a big dream, and the dreamer or the actor is God. God, or consciousness, is the actor which is playing every single part in the universe. That is, playing the part of you and me, playing the part of all animals and all fish, and all plants as well. God is the actor who acts from within. And because we are at some deep level God, our consciousness, our being, is a sliver of God. We can look at another human being, and instead of seeing them as an individual, instead of looking at their individuality, because we do have individuality, it's not that we have no individuality at all. It's that beneath our individuality is a very deep unity, which is the presence of God. So when you look at someone and you see them only in terms of their differences from you, then you feel very isolated and lonely in the universe. And you also, maybe you see that they're mean, you see that they're jaded, You see that they aren't trustful or loving. They're hateful and mean, and fearful. But if you are able to look at them and instead of seeing their differences, seeing this pure light within them that is wrapped in a web of fear and a web of confusion, then you can love anyone. But you aren't loving them as an ego. You're not loving their individual differences. You may love their individual differences, but you don't have to, because what you're loving is the God within them. And the way people often describe their experiences with God, because the purpose of meditation is often understood as to contemplate, to calm yourself, to cultivate compassion and understanding. But what meditation is also about is experiencing consciousness without the interruption of our thoughts, experiencing our consciousness uninterrupted by mental activity and sensory activity. That's why we close our eyes when we meditate and sit in a quiet place, is because we're trying to experience the consciousness that is aware of our senses and aware of our thoughts. Because we're always aware of something, we're not unable to observe the actual awareness or consciousness. So when you're deep in meditation and you go into what's called nirvikalpa samadhi, where you aren't having many thoughts at all, then you're able to understand that even if I don't have thoughts, even if I can't feel my body, I am still here. There's still a me. Even people have ego death experiences where, particularly on psychedelics or through meditation, they're able to experience what it's like to be egoless. And what they say is, underneath their ego, when they have an ego death, they're still there. Who they thought they were is gone, but the I, which we identify as me, is still there. There's still a being. And this being inside of us is like a little loving child. It is non-judgmental because it is aware of judgment. Judgment happens in the mind, and this consciousness is simply aware of it. It has no opinions because opinions are within the mind, and the consciousness is only aware of opinions. The consciousness doesn't do anything because it is aware of everything that is done. It's aware of our actions. So if you acknowledge that although I am an individual and I have all this individuality, beneath the individuality there is love and there's peace and there is happiness, because the nature of the self or the consciousness is happiness and peace. Even when you're in your darkest times, very deep in the pits, if you're able to acknowledge that there is still love and happiness within you, you may not experience the happiness because the happiness of the soul or the God within us is not the emotion of happiness. So this is where it gets a little confusing, is the happiness of the soul is referred to as Ananda in Hinduism, meaning bliss. And it's not that our consciousness is aware of happiness, because happiness, as we ordinarily understand it, is something that comes and goes. It's impermanent. But the happiness of our soul is constant. It is always there. And this is sort of the reason why through spiritual practice you develop happiness, is you realize that the happiness is always there, because the happiness is the nature of consciousness. We are happiness, you could say. And another attribute of consciousness, even though it's attributeless, is love. This is something that is so obvious when you think about it. The God within us is loving. It is curious. It is aware of what is and acknowledging what exists without any judgment of it. And this makes it pure, this makes it holy, and this makes it loving. So this is why you can look at another human being and love them without liking them, is because you're acknowledging what's within them that is holy and pure and loving. God, the consciousness, which is pretending to be this individual. And this is the game of karma, as understood from certain perspectives, is it is God playing hide and seek, going around this endless, on this endless, like, elliptical. Because the truth is you're going in circles. This is why it's referred to as the cycle of karma, or the cycle of samsara, is because it's as if you as God have forgotten your identity, and you're going around and around seeking happiness and seeking fulfillment, trying to get something out of life on whatever in whatever place that you exist as an individual soul. You are seeking out happiness, and it's constantly coming and going. And the reason why we go around this wheel of birth and death, of samsara, is because it's fun. The reason why we continue to remain as an individual and take incarnation after incarnation is because it's fun. And if you understand that, then you realize that life is like a beautiful game being played by God.